So this time is going to be a little different. I'm going to be talking about what I could best describe as a philosophical model for behavior, rather than what I usually do. Or pretty much a book, right? A philosophical model detailed within a book. So a few months ago, I came across a fellow YouTuber called Stefan Molyneux, and he's pretty popular, and he's the host of this online radio show called Freedomain Radio, and on it he pretty much talks to people who call in, and they discuss various topics, philosophy. There's a big philosophical lean with the channel. They talk about philosophy, about morality, about the state, about government, about psychology, so on and so forth, right? Stefan Molyneux himself is a libertarian, an anarcho-capitalist, so to speak. If you don't know what that is, it's pretty much the belief that the free market is the best thing there is. It'll decide everything for everybody, and the government should just go away. That's pretty much what it is. I mean, it's a bit more nuanced than that, but that's like a rough summary. And Steph Molyneux, once upon a time in 2007, wrote a book called Universally Preferable Behavior, and that's what I'm criticizing. Because I heard of this book, and then I read parts of the book, and then I read the book, and then I read critiques of the book, and I pretty much disagree with it outright. That's what I'll say. Universally preferable behavior. It's about like... It's weird, you know, usually I agree with Steph on most points. The reason I subscribed to the channel was because I saw a video. I saw his video on Elliot Rodger, and I agreed a lot on that, so, okay, I thought this is a guy I agree with. Let's see what he has to say. And I usually agree with him on stuff. You know, his thoughts on our culture, his thoughts about his women, his thoughts about, like, I don't know, war, some political stuff. I forget what else. But then every once in a while this, like, libertarianism propaganda comes out, and it's kind of off-putting because I don't agree with it at all. Libertarianism, well, I'll explain why, but libertarianism, I'm really skeptical towards it as a theory of moral thought, right? So it keeps coming up in his videos, and it's really weird because everything else seems perfectly rational and sane, but then every once in a while this screaming anarcho-capitalist demon just erupts in his videos, and he starts going on and on about how the state is horrible and should just go away, and it's just, why, right? And apparently he's been like this. Steph has been a libertarian for like 30 years or something, or he's been doing this for 30 years. I don't know the exact date, but he's believed this stuff for a while. And then he has this book, Universally Preferable Behavior, which the best way to describe it is it's his attempt at deriving libertarian ethics from first principles. That's what it is. You know, it's like deriving ethics from science. That's pretty much what it is. I mean, I'll go into more detail. The basic argument is that there exists this thing called universally preferable behavior. It's universally preferable because everybody prefers this kind of behavior. And the example, well, the way he defines it, he sort of defines it indirectly because he takes types of behavior that are not universally preferable. Because in any situation, if a person were experiencing this type of behavior from someone else, they would not prefer to experience that behavior. For instance, being raped. That's a pretty dark example, okay? Being stolen from, or being hurt in some way. Universally non-preferable, right? Because if you're on the shit end of that stick, you would prefer not to be. So it's universally preferable that people do not steal, and universally preferable that people do not rape, and so on and so forth. And that, you know, that seems to make sense on the face of it, but, you know, the argument that he makes is pretty much because universally preferable behaviors like this exist, then a person cannot, by definition, be for rape or for theft or for murder or for any of that stuff that they themselves would not like if they experienced it, because if they're for it, then they're a hypocrite. And because they'd be a hypocrite, that leads to a contradiction, therefore that's wrong, which means there's all this behavior that is not universally preferable, and the universally preferable behavior is what we should have in society. And this is, of course, an argument for libertarian philosophy in essence, because libertarian philosophy, the cornerstone of it is just the government is a bad, evil institution that steals from us through taxation. We should get rid of the government, and we'll live in this utopic paradise of the free market. That's the whole ideology. Of course, right? Yeah, that's the whole ideology. So the argument here is just like, you know, the universally preferable behavior are all the behaviors that are allowed within the free market, and universally non-preferable behaviors are the behaviors that would not be allowed. And the government is an institution that that does universally non-preferable stuff like theft through taxation, ergo it should go away. It all comes down to one of his basic principles called the non-aggression principle, which postulates just that you know, you cannot be aggressive, you cannot coerce people into doing things, you cannot initiate force, and the government initiates force through taxation. And universally preferable, the UPB model, that's what we'll call UPB, right? It explains why the government is wrong in doing that and why the NAP, the non-aggression principle, is correct, right? Throughout the book, he constantly uses this thought experiment. He says, imagine two guys in a room, right? Which is pretty much like the equivalent of imagine two people on the planet only instead of 7 billion, because it's easier to deal with two people, right? If you have two people, you know, imagine one of them steals from the other. You know, they can't both agree that theft is morally correct, right? Because theft can't be morally correct because whichever one gets stolen from would be against it. And or rather, theft cannot be universally preferable. That's what he's saying. Theft cannot be universally preferable. And all of this leads to libertarian ethics, right? So, okay, there's problems with the two guys in a room thought experiment, but I'll get to that later. I don't even know. I wonder if there's any more details I should mention about the UPB thing. But yeah, in essence, it's that. Granted, I will point out, one important thing is that when Stefan Molyneux explains it, he actually distinguishes between ethics and all the other stuff that UPB implies. Like ethics is specifically certain kinds of moral behavior is what is within the category of ethics, which is a little different from how I think. And when I use the word ethics, I usually think about all human behavior, period. So for this video, I'm going to use that definition. You know, whenever I use the word ethics, I mean all human behavior in general. Or actually, no, I'll use the word normative behavior or normative claims, right? Because UPB is making a normative claim, right? It's making inarguably it's making a normative claim about how our reality ought to be, right? And normative claims for me are the equivalent of ethical claims. For Steph, they're not. He has a slightly different definition, but I'll ignore that. I won't use that type of language. I'll just say normative ideas, right? Yeah, that's just the one thing I want to mention. I guess I could get to the counter argument at this point, because in essence, the whole idea sounds pretty simple. It's just, you know, there's universally preferable behavior. Like, okay, for example, if you're arguing with someone, then by definition, you are eliciting you prefer truth over falsehood if you're arguing for the truth, right? You prefer truth over falsehood. You also prefer to correct those who are wrong about something, right? If you're arguing with someone. If you're not arguing with someone, if you're just contemplating reality, then you still prefer truth over falsehood. The point is, you know, just by making this argument that I'm making in front of you right now, I certainly prefer truth over falsehood, and I certainly prefer correcting those who are wrong about stuff, right? I admit to that. I admit to that. You know, the whole idea behind UPB is pretty much, it's kind of anthropic, right? Like whenever you do something, there is a subconscious, implicit assumption about something you prefer. You know, you prefer to do the thing that you do, which is why you do it. Ergo, morality should be derived from that, right? It's the arguments are kind of like that. That's how they're phrased. Like the about the truth falsehood, then is literally something that's in the book, Universally Preferable Behavior. And the two guys in a room experiment is also something. Anyway, I don't recommend necessarily that people read it. You could probably just, it's probably useful to just find a summary online somewhere to get a good idea of what it's about. But I could give I'll give a better idea of what it's about. But the whole, I guess this video in general is intended for people who actually know Stefan Molyneux and who know libertarian philosophy and who know what I'm about to talk about. But let's get to the critiques, whatever. So I have two main counter-arguments against this. One counter-argument, the more obvious. Okay, there's two ways you can argue against morality. One way is to insult its axioms, to assault the axioms of the moral system. The other is to show that the axioms lead to contradictions within the system itself. So I'll do the first one first. I'll insult the axioms. I'm going to call upon Hume's fallacy, which states that one cannot derive a moral philosophy and a normative philosophy from a descriptive philosophy, right? One cannot derive morality from reality. Is does not imply ought. And the reason I make that claim is because it's weird, because I'm sure Steph has heard this claim, given that he's believed this stuff for a very long time. I'm sure he's heard Hume's fallacy every once in a while. What's weird is he doesn't seem to notice how Hume's fallacy undermines his entire line of thinking, because throughout Steph's videos, you get a very strong sense that he believes in what he believes, and that it's something that he's derived from first principles. First of all, what those first principles are, I have no idea. His first principles, or somebody else's first principles, or philosophy in general has first principles. As far as I know, there are no generalized first principles in philosophy. Philosophy is very, very subjective. But of course, Steph disagrees. In fact, he stated something like, and this is paraphrasing, but he said something like, people shouldn't say your philosophy or my philosophy. There's either good philosophy or bad philosophy. He sort of posits that philosophy is the same type of thing as mathematics. And although it uses logic, it is very, very different from science in that, I don't have no nice way to say this, but a lot of it is bullshit, maybe? It's not entirely like that, but the fact of it is, a lot of philosophers, a lot of thinkers are very, very influenced by personal experience, which influences their axioms, which influences their line of thinking, so you can't possibly say that there is good philosophy or bad philosophy. Unless all philosophy is bad philosophy. But a lot of philosophy is very different. A lot of philosophy is very subjective. This right here is very, very subjective. Okay? Definitions are subjective, but that's a whole other thing. The definitions here, not necessarily subjective, but the ideas are. The idea that UPB is a normative model is 100% arbitrary. Steph doesn't think so. He thinks that this is a principle that is derived from first principles and, perfect. Logically, it follows logically from all that stuff, but that's not possible because Hume's fallacy, like I said, Hume's fallacy says you can't look at science and reality and derive a normative system, because he doesn't just say that. The most you could say with UPB is, the most you can do is make it like a psychological analysis of human beings. You could say there are types of behavior that are universally preferable by people, and that depends on how we define universally preferable, but sure, that could exist. I'm not denying that. Nobody would deny that. The problem is, you can't, that doesn't mean that reality ought to be in some way. That doesn't mean that the state should not exist. That doesn't mean that people should follow the non-aggression principle and so on and so forth, okay? Morality does not follow from reality. That's pretty much the basic cornerstone of this. Now, unless Steph denies Hume's fallacy entirely, which I really doubt, and if he does, he's insane, because there's no way you can deny that. Hume's fallacy follows logic, like, Hume's fallacy follows logically. It follows from basic logic. Like, there's reality and then there's morality, and they do not intersect whatsoever. Like, anytime you make a claim, like if reality is in state A and you're going to make the claim, well, reality should be in state B because that's a normative claim, right? There is no logical connection between the two. Like, the logical connection about what is correct in the reality should be in state B, what is the correct value of B, there's no way to determine the correct value of B in that case, right? It's 100% arbitrary. It depends very much on the person speaking and what they believe and their experiences. Okay? So the idea that the idea that UPB is universal, the idea that UPB is somehow implies all this stuff about, and that libertarian philosophy follows, is arbitrary. It's 100% arbitrary. And I'm not saying it's wrong or that I disagree. I'm saying it's arbitrary. And the reason I stress that is because Steph doesn't seem to realize this. He doesn't believe that it's arbitrary. He believes it follows from first principles. And he actually gets really mad, or I wouldn't say mad, but he pretty much disrespects anyone who he has this very weird philosophical arrogance to him. Okay? It's a very weird arrogance. It's like, you can't disagree with me because what I believe follows from first principles. You can't disagree with me because, all of this is deductive and obvious from first principles. You can't disagree with me on that basis. So the people that do disagree with him made a logical error somewhere, is his belief. And at no point does he affirm, at no point does he acknowledge that everything he believes about morality and ethics, and including the NAP and property rights, that all that stuff is arbitrary. He doesn't believe that. He doesn't believe that it's arbitrary. He thinks it follows from this crap, but it doesn't follow from this stuff. It follows from nothing. It's his own personal bias leading him to come up with that stuff, right? Like, whenever we talk about morality, we have to come up with axioms. And usually I'd say 90% of the time, when two people disagree about a moral claim, it's because they have different moral axioms to begin with. One person has, a system, a moral framework that has certain axioms. The other person has different axioms, and of course they're going to disagree then, right? So, if there's a disagreement on the axiomatic level, then there's basically no communication to be had. The most you can do is try and convince the other person to accept your axioms. And I don't know how you could even argue that, because at the end of the day, they're arbitrary. I mean, you can make the claim that, you can maybe agree on what morality is supposed to give society and what you want to get to and what utopia, you're trying to build as a species. And if the two people arguing agree on that, then maybe they can agree on axioms and see morality as just a means of getting to that utopia. Then they can agree, and then the logic follows. But rarely have I seen where people agree on axioms and disagree on conclusions. Logic in philosophy isn't fickle. It's pretty straightforward stuff. It's not like very abstract or very complex, at least not when it comes to behavior, right? So the disagreements come from arbitrary stuff like this, and that's what I want to stress. I want to stress that this is arbitrary, and I hate the fact that Steph doesn't believe it's arbitrary because he thinks, well, whatever, enough about that. But the point is that it is arbitrary, and the fact that he hasn't realized it's arbitrary is like a lack of self-awareness on his part. Where it comes from, I have no clue, but the point is it is there. Okay, one thing I can point out is that this whole like UPB model, it rests on this idea of preference. You prefer not to be stolen from, and I want to point out that there's a fundamental difference. Well, okay, the definition of preference is very important, but there can be a fundamental difference between preference and what one believes to be morally correct, okay? Human beings have very many different instincts, okay? There's self-preservation instincts, there's, instincts to have sex, there's instincts to do art, right? There's all these different instincts on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Those those 5 layers represent all the different things that people want. So the fact that one of those layers contradicts with another is not that's not like a logical contradiction. That happens in reality. I actually want to point out I went online and I found a critique of UPB by I forget the website, I'll put the link on, but it was by another libertarian called David Gordon, and he disagreed with UPB, and in one of his, and then Molyneux responded to him, and then he responded to Molyneux, and they never reached a consensus as far as I know, but Gordon pretty much said that this universality criterion doesn't make any sense because a person, you know, a preference and morality are not, they're not the same thing, they're not the same concept. One can have moral beliefs that are completely different from his preferences, okay? Like, what he was pointing out with the two guys in a room, and let's say one wants to, Steph was saying if there's two guys in a room, right, they can't both believe that theft is a morally good thing because it contradicts their preferences. What Gordon was saying was that they can because, you know, let's say that person A steals from person B, despite being stolen from, could still believe that being stolen from is a good thing, despite not wanting to be stolen from. Right? So, like, there's nuances like that to it. I mean, I'll talk about the preference thing later. I just wanted to point out that it's there. That's actually, this delves into the second counter-argument, the contradictions within UPB, not the axioms of UPB itself. Let's keep talking about the axioms, actually. I mean, other than that, hypocrisy does not imply moral contradiction, right? But let's talk about the axioms. I just want to point out that the fact that the way that Steph's thinking is structured, he very strongly believes in a principle. Like, I recall in one video, he was talking to some woman, and she told him, you know, I have people who disagree with me in my life, you know, that they're not against taxation. And he was saying, he told her, you know, give them a few months, you know, argue to them, give them a few months. Or he said, no, okay, what he said was, ask them, are they for the initiation of force? And she was like, okay, no, we're not for the initiation of force. And then he's like, okay, well then you're against taxation, is what he would say. And then they'd say, no, we're not against taxation. And to this, Molyneux said, well, then these people just don't understand what a principle is. So, okay, they could have a very different idea of what a principle is defined as than you do. But brushing that aside, why must there be a principle? You know, why does the non-initiation of force need to be a principle? Why can't the initiation of force be okay in certain circumstances, right? You know, why can't we take a consequentialist approach? You know, why can't we look at consequences? Why can't we look at circumstances? Why is it so rigid in that, you know, in reality everywhere, all the time, the initiation of force always bad, just because there's a label that says that it is? Why? I mean, the most I'm going to say is that label is arbitrary. Oh, damn. Right, sorry about that. My computer accidentally sprang to life from, on me and invaded. Anyway, right, sorry. What I was saying was, why does the initiation of force have to be a principle? Why does it have to be so rigid? Why is this criterion, okay, like why? And Steph would say, oh, because that's what a principle is. Why does a principle have to be that? You know, why do you have this very sort of strict view of it? Because it's not necessary. I mean, it's very Kantian the way I see it. It's very categorical. It's very much like the categorical imperative if you think about it. It's holy crap. It's actually it's scary. It's so much like the categorical imperative, the first formulation. Like Kant would be like, you know, if there's a boat with like thousands of people on it and it's sinking, and the only way to stop it from sinking is to throw one person overboard, then Kant would say, Immanuel Kant would say, we don't throw the person overboard because killing is immoral by the categorical imperative, so everybody sinks and everybody dies. And this is like the exact same thing. The non-aggression principle says the exact same thing. At least that's what I understand. Or maybe it doesn't, because then, like, because these people's lives are threatened, then the self-defense principle gets called upon, or some other crap that Molyneux has in his arsenal. I just find it ironic. Like, whatever other stuff he comes up with, the point is that the principle is strikingly similar. And it's ironic because Immanuel Kant is someone that Ayn Rand really, really hated. And Ayn Rand is a huge inspiration for Stefan Molyneux, from what I know. So that's really, really bizarre. I just want to point that out. That's really ironic. But yeah, the fact is, like, whenever morality sort of follows just a rigid system of principles, I get sort of skeptical, because it immediately sounds religious to me. Like, it immediately sounds sort of very, something you have to be very zealous in order to believe, because any rational person, you can just bring up a consequentialist argument that defeats any of them, okay? Would you abandon your principles to save the human species? Okay, if there's a space pirate who was going to destroy the entire planet, and he wanted you to break the non-aggression principle in order to stop it from happening, would you do it? Okay? The answer to that is obvious, and that might seem like an extreme case, but cases similar to that happen all the time. Well, not similar to that, but cases that are structurally similar to that, where the consequence matters. That's the idea there. The consequence really, really matters in that scenario. But Steph hates consequentialist arguments. I might be paraphrasing, but what he said about a consequentialist argument at one point is something along the lines of, consequentialism sounds like you're moving objects and people around, but ignoring the fact that a principle was broken. And again, it's this whole like arbitrary call to the idea that there was a principle, that the principle that somehow was broken. Okay, a principle is not something set in stone in reality. It can change, it can be malleable, right? It's something we can fiddle with. It doesn't have to be this rigid this rigid commandment that we achieve from God? Oh no, from the universe, from reality again. Well, it's stupid. Okay, any morality that's not consequentialist, I think is retarded. I'm gonna be honest, because you can't ignore bad consequences. Like if there's gonna be a bad consequence, you have to address the fact that there's gonna be a bad consequence, right? Otherwise, you're just retarded. And in fact, okay, well, I'm not gonna argue for consequentialism here. That's just something I wanted to point out. I think this, like, the reasoning here is very arbitrary, is what I'm saying. The reasoning behind all this, it's all like based on arbitrary assumptions that there's these things called principles that are derived from reality, and that these principles are universally preferable, and that we must follow a morality that strictly adheres to these principles. And it's all just like, what are you talking about, man? Okay, you just gave a speech, which Steph gives very often on his channel, about being rational, being self-critical, being philosophical, and then you just spewed a whole bunch of crap that doesn't make any sense, that is literally 100% arbitrary, that you made up. Okay? Why is my question. I'm not saying it's wrong, again, I'm just saying it's arbitrary. It's arbitrary, and that needs to be pointed out, that it's arbitrary. I mean, I could actually be 100% wrong. Maybe I've misinterpreted UPB completely, and it's actually not making a normative claim at all. It's actually just making a descriptive claim, in which case, great. Great, I don't care then. I was criticizing it under the assumption that it was a normative philosophy, which you derive from reality somehow. It's weird. But yeah. Once again, the whole problem with deriving normative from descriptive is that reality in state A does not imply reality should be in state B, or that there is a correct value for B in that syllogism, right? There is no correct value for B. B is 100% arbitrary, and it can be contradictory, and it can, and there can be hypocrisy in that the person that derived B can have preferences that contradict B, as I've already pointed out. So let's just put that out there. Hume probably has a more elegant proof of his fallacy, but it follows very much from logic. If you ask, like it follows. It's obvious if you ask me, right? It seems very obvious. You have reality, and then morality is arbitrary no matter how you look at it. And if it's arbitrary no matter how you look at it, then what he is saying itself is also arbitrary. Anyway, let's talk about the problems with UPB relative to itself. And this is the stuff that's more interesting, I'd say, right? So, the problem with the two men in a room thought experiment is that there's literally dozens of examples I can think of that totally screw it up. Or, they don't screw it up, but what they do is they lead to a moral principle that does not, that is not equivalent to libertarianism and anarcho-capitalism and whatever else that Steph believes in, right? Okay, I already mentioned how prefer is not well defined, and that's really a big point, because the fact that you can use words like prefer really suggests that there is some sort of way to compare the different preferences, the different instincts that people have, as described by, say, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where you have, a person has will to survive, to seek comfort, to have intercourse, to have respect, to follow morality, right? People have all these different instincts. Which one of these instincts on Maslow's hierarchy does prefer refer to? Or does it refer to all of them? It can't refer to all of them, I just want to point out, because if it refers to all of them, then then you run into the problem of it can't refer to all of them, because then a person's preferences can literally be contradictory, and then there is no universally preferable behavior whatsoever, because, again, something on the fifth layer of Maslow's hierarchy of needs can contradict something on the first layer, or something on the fifth layer can contradict something on the third layer. Like, again, the fifth layer of Maslow's hierarchy is strict intellectual morality. Like, I can believe taxation is good, even if I'm being taxed, even if it contradicts, even if it gets in the way of my love life, even if it gets in the way of my will to live comfortably, and so on and so forth. I could still believe that taxation is justified. And this is exactly what David Gordon was saying, how, we have moral ideologies that don't coincide with our preferences, that there is a innate hypocrisy to the human spirit that for all intents and purposes may never be eliminated, okay? The body is designed to always put its own interests first, and that's the first layer of Maslow's hierarchy. But morality talks about the fifth. So, I mean, if you're going to talk about UPB, if you're going to talk about preferable ethics, which layer of Maslow's hierarchy are we talking about? Because that really matters. It can't be all of them. It definitely can't be all of them. It can't be one of them either, because, having prefer be any one of refer to any one of the instincts also leads to weird contradictions, and not necessarily contradictions, but weird questions that the book does not answer, and that Steph himself has never actually answered, from what I know. At least, I haven't seen all his videos, but it's something I think he's never answered, okay? Because human beings always do things that contradict one instinct they have or another. Like, I'd prefer not to work. I'd prefer not to go to school. I would prefer to just sit around and lounge and do my own thing. But I do that stuff anyway, because another part of me does prefer that stuff. It does prefer to work. It does prefer to go to school, because the consequences of doing that stuff are beneficial to me in some other way, so I prefer them. Okay? Does that mean I am making some sort of logical fallacy contradiction? Which of these things do I actually prefer, work or not work? Because the way it sounds, I can't actually, you can make the argument here that work is universally non-preferable. Actually, no, I'm going to take a step back and explain what exactly he's doing, because in the book he doesn't actually list like all of these types of behaviors that are universally preferable. What he does is he tries to prove the converse. He tries to say, okay, here's a type of behavior that is not universally preferable. Here's a type of behavior that is never universally preferable, like rape, because if it were happening to you, you wouldn't prefer it, right? Or theft, and so on and so forth. And basically, once you compile all the lists of behaviors that are non-universally preferable into a list, you come up with all of the stuff that that Stefan Molyneux deems as violence, or that he deems to be the initiation of force or coercion, all of the stuff that the non-aggression principle tells you not to do. The problem with all of that is that there is so much other stuff that can fit into that category of non-universally preferable behavior. You know, like what he's doing, like I want to like draw a picture, but it's hard. Like, okay, imagine this like circle to be a set of all human behavior. And imagine that there's like a few points in here that are rape and theft and violence, and all these points are aggression, various forms of aggression. And he's saying that the correct kind of behavior is the entire set minus all of those points that are non-universally preferable. And what I'm saying is that there could be tons of other points in the set that are also non-universally preferable that he may not have even looked at. Okay? For example, no, okay, I actually have to think about an example because it's not obvious. Okay, well, for example, going to work, or going to school, or doing any sort of work that requires effort, that requires you to get up off your ass and actually do something, is non-universally preferable. Because whoever does it doesn't want to do it, right? So they prefer not to do it. They do it anyway because there's another preference in Maslow's hierarchy that tells them to do it, but it's not the same preference that makes them want to just sit around and do nothing, right? It's not the same preference that actually tells them what they do want to do, okay? Like, you know, getting out of bed in the morning, or exerting yourself physically, going to the gym, you know, there's all of these different instincts that human beings have. On the one side, there's when you're at the gym, your body's telling you, your body's in pain, and that should be a signal to stop. But on the other hand, there's the endorphin rush you get from working out. And on the third hand, there's the health you get from, you know, there's the thought about future consequence, the health you get from being healthy, having worked out, and being respected for being, I don't know, muscly and good looking for having worked out. Okay, these are separate instincts, okay? But when you do it, you could argue it's not universally preferable because these instincts are denied. So that's why I asked which human instincts, or at least what part of Maslow's hierarchy of needs or whatever, is UPB talking about? Because if it's talking about the stuff right at the bottom, then a whole bunch of other stuff is factored out of that entire set of human behavior, right? Because a whole bunch of other stuff that people do goes against their most basic instincts at a time. At least at some point while you're working out, you probably want to stop working out. Okay, at some point while you're working out, you prefer not to be in pain, okay? Going to work, you prefer not to work. You would prefer to just have wealth. You'd prefer to just have money and not have to exert yourself. Okay, you would prefer to, I don't know, drown in pussy and not have to and not have to date women or put up with, I don't know. Okay, the point is, okay, the instinct, there are different instincts within the human psyche that constantly contradict one another, constantly. And if UPB is talking about just one of them, or just some of these instincts, then the problem is that these instincts are denied many, many times besides violations of the non-aggression principle, okay? As far as I can tell, the non-aggression principle, the instincts it violates, the preferences it violates, is when a person is when some comfort that a person usually has is getting violated. Like if you're getting murdered, it's your life. If you're being stolen from, something you own is being stolen, that's your comfort going away. If you're getting raped, that's again your well-being and your comfort that is being violated. But again, those things can be violated a number of ways that do not involve the non-aggression principle. My point is, even if UPB is right about this, and sure it is, it does not lead to libertarian ethics. It does not lead to the non-aggression principle. It doesn't lead to the NAP, because the NAP is very, very specific. It doesn't talk about behavior in general. It talks about very specific kinds of behavior. Aggression. And not even all aggression. It talks about specific kinds of aggression. It talks about the kind of aggression you get when there is an agent, a human agent, causing the aggression to happen, right? Okay? Or an institution made by human agents. Actually, I'm actually kind of making assumptions here. I don't totally know when the NAP applies, but as far as I can tell, it will not apply in all the types of behavior denied by UPB, the way I understand it. Another kind of UPB type that can exist. Okay, well, I can actually give another more specific example. Imagine that two guys in a room, right? And one of them has medicine, and they both have like property rights, right? Because this is in UPB, they both have property rights, they both, whatever. And one of them has medicine, and the other's poisoned. How he got poisoned, who knows? This is just the state of being, right? This is simply how they started out. And the first refuses to sell the medicine to the second. Why? It's not the second doesn't have enough money. Nope, he just wants to see the second guy die. He just wants to see him suffer. He just doesn't care. And he's not obligated to sell the antidote, right? He's not obligated to sell the medicine by the nap. You know, he can do whatever he wants. That's his property, right? Now let me point out, let me suggest something that might sound a little crazy, but would the person who can't get the antidote prefer to be in that situation? Or is that a universally non-preferable state of being? I wonder. Is that a universally non-preferable state of being? I think it's a universally non-preferable state of being. No matter who you ask, no matter who it is, okay? If you're, say, poor and you have to support a kid, let's say it's not even you that's poison, let's say it's your child that needs medicine and nobody wants to sell it to you. I think this is another example that David Gordon suggested, but if the free market can't supply you with what you need, and you don't have the monetary, you don't have the wealth to get what you need, you don't have the productivity to get what you need, the free market literally doesn't solve your problem. Imagine that. That is a universally non-preferable state of being. Unless he thinks the free market solves everything, but it doesn't, of course, because there's examples where it doesn't. Okay, if you don't have enough money, if you don't have enough wealth, if you haven't accrued, if you have no skills, no talents, nothing of value to sell, right? That is a universally non-preferable state of being, no matter how you look at it, right? Of course, Steph is going to say, okay, well then you're responsible for that. You have to face the consequences of your actions with responsibility. That's your responsibility to be in that situation. You aren't given freedom from anything. You had the freedom to develop talents and to accrue wealth and to have money to pay for the medicine to save your kid, but the fact that it doesn't happen, that's your fault. So your kid dies and then you die from grief. That's what Stefan Molyneux suggests, but that's crazy. That's crazy. Okay, so, maybe it's not crazy, right? I would think it's crazy, but the point is that does not go in line with UPB. UPB says universally preferable behavior, and we're looking at universally non-preferable types of behavior to figure out what it is that to figure out what it is that human behavior should not have. That's where the nap comes from. The nap is derived from UPB, excluding the kinds of behavior that will always be disliked with two guys in a room. And I'm saying that there's very, very, very many kinds of behavior that will not be universally preferable with two guys in a room, other than rape, other than murder, other than initiation of force as Steph classically sees it. That's what I'm saying. Of course, the counter-argument Steph would make here is that, the nap applies only to those kinds of behaviors that have a human agent of causation, or something along those lines, I think. Maybe he'd say, okay, but that person isn't obligated to sell you the medicine because the nap doesn't tell him to. So there's nothing morally wrong in that situation. Okay. So then it's morally okay that you die without having medicine. Well, the point is, even if that's not universally preferable, the point is there needs to be a human cause to your pain, to your suffering, for it to be for it to constitute initiation of force, for it to constitute coercion, for it to constitute the stuff that we deny within the NAP framework, right? And that stuff isn't well defined. Okay, first of all, having a human agent is, again, 100% arbitrary, like I've already pointed out. And the other problem with it is that that itself isn't well defined, that idea of having a human agent of causation. You know, the initiation of force is initiated by a human being specifically, then it's wrong. But if it's initiated by the free market in general, or no one particular person, then it's okay. Okay? If force is initiated by just reality, then that's okay. It's actually weird. I talked to... Well, when I was going through this stuff, I was sort of brainstorming it, and I was asking other people what they thought about this stuff, and I talked about property rights. And I mentioned, okay, well, what about the... You know, I asked my friend, what do you think about the non-aggression principle and property rights? And one of my friends immediately said, well, doesn't property rights deny, like, the NAP is initiation of force. Doesn't property rights constitute initiation of force? Interesting, right? And I laughed, right? Because of course it does. Of course it does. You know, if there's two guys in a room and they each own half a room, then the one guy on the one half is denied entry to the other half because that's the other guy's property. Right? What he, you know, he is not allowed to choose what happens on that side of the property. That is fucked up. Okay, that is 100% in the initiation of force. Here's this part of the planet, you know, it's just 7 billion people sharing the planet, but here's one chunk of it that's mine, and none of you can enter it. Okay? How is that non-initiation of force? If I'm walking down the street and then somebody buys the land in front of me, then I can't enter that land unless they give me unless they allow me to go through that land. That's initiation of force. I'm sorry. And Steph would say, okay, but there's no human agent causation. It's caused by the free market being the way it is. What does it matter, though? I thought the problem was the initiation of force in general, unless the problem... I thought that's what the problem was. Although looking at this, it seems that the problem is whenever this holy idea of the free market is being somehow scrutinized, that's the problem. That's what Steph's problem is. It's not when there's initiation of force. Because yeah, that's what I'm going to say. And I want to say a few more things, but before I conclude here, I'm actually going to take a small break, so be right back. And yes, sorry for that. Really sorry for that edit. Anyway, thinking about it, given my example about, okay, well, if there's initiation of force on you by a person, that's initiation of force, that's bad, that stuff needs to be euthanized from reality. But if there's initiation of force on you by the free market or by, I don't know, reality, then what Steph would say, oh, well, that's reality. That's what he would say. I guarantee you that word would come out of his mouth. And now I'm puzzled, because how can you have such a callous point of view? That's reality. Reality doesn't have to be that way, though. It doesn't have to be that way. You know, reality wouldn't have to be that way through taxation or I don't know, society coming together and trying to help one another. No, oh, but that would break the other principle. So that's obviously bad. I mean, it's just it's backwards. I mean, that's reality. Well, you know, some guy raping a woman, that's also reality. Somebody killing someone else, that's reality. Me stealing a Pokemon card from my friend, that's also reality, okay? All of that is reality. On what basis are you going to tell me that this type of reality is bad, but that type of reality is okay? That type of reality is okay, that type of reality is just the reality you have to deal with. No, 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 no. 100% arbitrary, once again. This is the type of reality Steph doesn't want to deal with. That's the type of reality he's okay with dealing with. So what he's saying now is it should be enforced onto everyone. Actually, that's the first argument I already made. I'm not going to go back to that. Returning to UPB specifically, though. Like, okay, I already basically said what needed to be said about it, though. I mean, like, if you're not explicit about what kind of preferences you're talking about, there's going to be so many problems. And UPB... there is no way that this UPB model derives the NAP. It does not derive property rights. Libertarian philosophy does not arise from UPB. UPB is strictly speaking about... I mean, it's weird. With UPB, you can actually go either way. You can either you can go to the type of behavior that is, you know, literally perfect in every way because it doesn't cause a non-preferable reaction in anyone, or you can go the other way, in which case nothing is universally preferable. Yeah, you can either go one. Either everything is universally preferable because any kind of behavior is okay on some level of Maslow's hierarchy, because like, oh, well, theft through taxation is okay, therefore theft is okay on, you know, because of level, you know, because of the fifth level of Maslow's hierarchy, right? You can either go that way, or you can go the other way where nothing is okay via UPB. So yeah, it's a very, very weird, hairy area, as far as I'm concerned. You know, UPB, it's like... It's pathetic in a way, because what he's trying to do is he's trying to derive morality by looking at human preferences, which is such a complicated topic, in all honesty. Human preferences, do you have any idea what a complicated thing that is? Human preferences are like all over the place, okay? To say that there's one firm way to define them all and to sort of like linearize them all and then to derive a framework from them all, and to say that there's some preferences that are universally preferable. That's just... So there's some behavior that is universally preferable. That is just weird. The other part of it is, you know, if the free market is in some way responsible for your misfortune, then you can't say that that's universally non-preferable behavior, because it's not the behavior of a person that you're criticizing, right? You're not criticizing the behavior of a person, that's just reality. That's the problem. Okay, it's like, it's not like somebody went into your house and, like, you know, stole your shoes, right? It's not like that, because there, you know, they could have just not stolen your shoes and the problem would have been solved. Here, you know, the free market, there's no one person to blame, and that's why, because there's no, like, figurehead to blame, there's no scapegoat, there's no person you can point to and say, well, it's you, it's your fault, then it doesn't count as human behavior, then it doesn't violate the NAP, and so on and so forth. Honestly, this kind of thinking is childlike. Like, instead of just, because you can't point to a person and label them as the one at fault, the terrorizer, the terrorist, the you know, the murderer, the thief, etc., so on and so forth, because you can't do that, somehow it doesn't violate the principle. But that's so not true, okay? You know, let's say I'm walking down the street and a piece of glass falls from a building, hits me in the head, and just injures me, and I don't have the money to pay for medical, whatever, and people walk by me and they just walk on by me, they don't care. Let's say I'm injured and they do nothing, they just walk by, that's it. According to the NAP, that's perfectly fine. They're not obligated to do anything for me. But is that universally preferable? No. Nobody would want to be in that position. And as to whose behavior is at fault, you can't point to any one person, but you can't point to reality either. You know, you could still point to multiple people. You could still point to all these... Hell, you could point to all these people and say, hey, you guys should help me, given that I'm injured here on the street with a shard of glass going through my toe, or my foot, or my face, okay? You know, you guys should help me, to help me get out of that. The fact that you guys aren't helping me is immoral. That is the initiation of force. I could say that, and that's just as valid as what Steph is saying. It's literally just as valid. Because it all comes back down to how you define initiation of force. And Steph simply defines it as there's this small set of behaviors that counts as initiation of force by one particular person or an institution. But when it's more nuanced like this, when there's no particular person to blame, where there's indifference, not necessarily coercion or malice, but specific indifference, just people walking by the street not caring, that's okay. That's perfectly fine. I say it's not fine. You know, I say it's not fine, and it does violate the non-aggression principle because it violates UPB, okay? It is literally universally non-preferable to be in that situation where people are walking by you on the street and there is a shard of glass in your eye. Universally non-preferable. Nobody would want to be in that situation. And saying that it's just reality and you should deal with it is morally bankrupt. Because, sure, even if it is reality, that doesn't mean reality should be like that. Remember, we're talking morality. We're talking about normative claims, okay? If other people on the street should give up some of their time, some of their money even, to help the person who has a shard of glass sticking out of their eye, I think they should. I think they should. I think the benefits outweigh the costs. And frankly, violating the nap in that case is okay. Hell, I could say because the nap was violated for this one person with a shard of glass in their face by reality, then another principle is invoked that applies to all the people walking by that forces them to give that person money, called the empathy principle. Let's call it the empathy principle. And the reason I'm making an analogy like this is because Steph does this as well. Okay, because there's situations where it's okay to violate the nap, right? You know, if you're in self-defense mode, it's okay to violate the nap. If you're protecting yourself or protecting your property or protecting your loved ones, blah, 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 all of these various scenarios, then violating the nap is okay, and instead you invoke the self-defense principle or some other fucking principle or some other random list of arbitrary principles. My point is I can do that too. I say reality violated the nap by sticking a shard of glass in that person's eye, and therefore, the people walking around should help that person, are morally obligated to help that person via the empathy principle. The nap no longer applies in this case for them. Instead, the empathy principle is invoked. I could say that, and that's just as valid because it's just as arbitrary and it follows the same kind of thinking. Instead, though, what I would say is I wouldn't talk about the nap or the empathy principle or any kind of principle. I would instead just look at the reality of the situation and just look at the consequences, because that would yield the same moral result. That's what I would do. My point is, this entire nap approach is just, it's arbitrary and it's just wrong, because there are so many other situations where a similar approach, an identical approach, like what I just described, like the empathy principle, suddenly applies to the people walking around the injured on the street. That is analogous to the self-defense principle being invoked when the nap is violated. That is 100% analogous and just as valid, and I think that actually coincides with libertarian philosophy. You know, I think it does. Or, sorry, not necessarily coincides with their philosophy, but it coincides with this whole nap property rights stuff that Steph is pushing. And last but not least, but I do have to say that even if for whatever reason this does not coincide with what Steph is saying, because he's got like a brilliant counter argument up his sleeve, then it still coincides with UPB. UPB in no way implies nap. In no way implies nap, because UPB is it's undefined. Preference is not well defined. Aggression is not well defined either, but preference is definitely not well defined. Not in the book, not in anything Steph has ever said. It's not well defined. And for it to be well defined, I guarantee you there would be more stuff in there, more stuff within the set of non-universally preferable behavior or universally non-preferable behavior other than what's contained within the NAP, within the types of behaviors that the NAP counters. There would be so many other forms of behavior that are universally non-preferable other than what's contained in the NAP. That's what I'm going to say. And again, this also comes back to what Steph kept saying about freedom to and freedom from. In one of his latest videos, he said he was making this contrast between freedom to and freedom from. And he was saying freedom to is what libertarians stand for. Freedom from is not what we stand for. Freedom from responsibility is not something we're okay with at all. That's a paradox. Well, it's not a paradox, but it's stupid, because freedom to and freedom from are not mutually exclusive. They actually coincide. For instance, I could say, look, as a libertarian, you want freedom from taxes, you want freedom from all this other stuff. That's just as valid, okay? What he's saying is freedom from moral responsibility for your actions. That's horrible. You guys want freedom from. You can't have freedom from. Well, I could say, well, you want freedom from taxes, and that's your social responsibility. You want freedom from social responsibility. That's just as, like, see, it's just as valid. It's the same kind of thinking, only applied to a different aspect of society, right? And the Freedom 2 stuff is so breathtakingly naive, I have no words for it. Freedom 2. In what universe does Freedom 2 even exist? Let me ask you that. How is the free market, Freedom 2, anything? It's like, you know, you have the freedom to be whatever you want, but you have to do this and this and this, and you have to have an education and that and blah blah blah. That's not freedom to. That's all of these requirements being put on you. And you have to make money, and you have to go work at a shitty job to make money, to pay your bills in order to do all this other stuff, to get the education you need so that you can get the job that you want. Like, what? People don't start on an even playing field for Freedom 2 to even make sense. But even if they did, it still doesn't make sense because Freedom 2 suggests that you can just do anything, but you can't do anything. There will always be limitations on you placed there by society. Not by reality, by society. And if society can fix itself or change itself and correct itself in such a way that those limitations aren't there, then it should. As far as I'm concerned, not according to Steph. As far as Steph is concerned, if there's any limitation on what you can do, that's reality. That's reality. That's something you just have to deal with. Wow. That's something you just have to deal with. Please, please. I mean, if it's something you just have to deal with, then, I mean, if that's the argument he makes, then again, I just return back to the whole thesis I started with, which is, well, that's just arbitrary, so go to hell. But, and like, even so, it's still an unnecessary, saying that it's something you have to deal with is an unnecessary acceptance of the limitations of reality. That's what I think it is. You know, as a society, if we can collectively and through use of technology and all this stuff fix ourselves and fix the way that we work and fix the way that people are taught and fix and make things easier for everybody, there's literally no reason not to do that. There is literally no the costs of that, whatever, there's literally no reason not to do that. Okay? And when you do that, then you have freedom too. Until then, you don't have freedom too. Until then, there's all these limitations. And libertarian philosophy, as far as I'm concerned, is perfectly okay with the limitations. They have all these principles that they believe in, and they're perfectly okay with all of the crap of reality and of society and of free markets that is being flushed in, and they're perfectly okay with keeping all that stuff there. They have no intention of getting rid of it. Probably because they think that that's just a facet of reality that can't be escaped. Maybe some of them think that. Maybe some of them think that. Maybe some of them accept that it's something that is a facet of free markets, but it's not something they want to get rid of. Maybe they so avidly believe in free markets that it's something that they genuinely think is there and should stay there, and that the problems of free markets are necessary evils. I don't agree. Because there's no way that they're necessary evils. I mean, that's kind of a different argument, but my point is, libertarianism, it's either the willingness to have limitations on society and to keep limitations on society in order to adhere to some arbitrary principle, or it's the excuse to do whatever it is you want with your well-earned money. Well-earned money. That's what it is. It's the excuse to not have social responsibility. You know, you have responsibility to yourself and your property, but you don't have social responsibility via the libertarian dogma. Anyway, I hope that's basically like, I've already covered the reasons why UPB is completely ridiculous. I mean, I would need to perhaps do more research or listen to Steph more to actually find out if he explains the idea of preference more, but the fundamental flaw of it is that the idea of preference is not well defined, and as far as morality is concerned, it is perfectly okay that morality disagrees with your other instincts, because hell, morality isn't even something that's defined on the lower levels of Maslow's hierarchy. Morality is something that's on the fifth, the highest level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So if we take Maslow's hierarchy as a model, and there's other psychological models I'm aware, but if we take Maslow as a model, then you have to assume right off the bat that there are differences between some human preferences and others. And to say that preference in general matters is just stupid, because you have not said anything concrete whatsoever. You haven't said what preferences matter, you haven't said what type of preferences matter. And if the case is that, well, okay, I don't actually want to get into this argument, because I don't know, to this point, I still don't know what Steph means when he uses preference in UPB. Because if he's talking about the stuff that's at the bottom of Maslow's pyramid, then he is 100% wrong about everything. If he's talking about the stuff that's at the bottom, then he's completely wrong, because he doesn't even live by the stuff that's at the bottom. Because the whole point of having higher layers of the pyramid is so that you the whole point of having morality is so that you can avoid living at the bottom layers of the pyramid. The bottom layers of the pyramid are not something that we morally should strive for. They are simply the baseline lizard brain, okay? They're just there. They're not something that we... they're not something to idolize. They're not something to base a moral theory around, right? If he's talking about the stuff that's at the top, he's also wrong, because the stuff that's at the top is not the kind of behavior he's talking about when he talks about theft and rape and all the stuff in UPB, and it's not the type of behavior he talks about within the NAP. You know, the types of behaviors at the top of Maslow's pyramid, they are not discussed whatsoever by libertarian philosophy or anything. As far as I'm concerned, Steph assumes that that stuff doesn't even exist. Okay, well, I mean, I'm not sure how Steph perceives preference, but the stuff at the top of Maslow's hierarchy is not the stuff he talks about when he derives the NAP. It's not the stuff he talks about when he, in UPB at all. He doesn't talk about it in UPB. In his derivation, that there exist, you know, universally preferable forms of behavior, and theft as a counterexample, he does not talk about stuff at the top of Maslow's hierarchy. He talks about the bottom. By definition, he talks about the bottom. Okay, if it's two guys in a room and something is being stolen from you and you don't like the fact, oh, okay, actually better, you're being murdered and you don't like the fact that you're being murdered, that's not the top layer of Maslow's hierarchy in contradiction. That's the bottom layer. That's the self-preservation instinct in you that's telling you that you being murdered is not something you want. Okay? That you being murdered is not something you want. That's not what he meant at all in UPB. Okay, when he talked about UPB, he literally talked about the lower levels of Maslow's hierarchy, and that's why I'm saying that preference, like the whole term, is just false. It's just retarded. It's retarded language, and it doesn't make any sense because the language isn't used properly. It's not used well, right? Anyway, I guess concluding thoughts. Okay, well, I mean, I'll say, based on this video, I guess you could conclude from, I mean, you can conclude based on what you've seen that I am not a fan of Steph's views, right? I am not a fan of this libertarian stuff. I'm not a fan of UPB. I'm not a fan of the NAP. Nope, I'm not a fan of the NAP. So you wonder, okay, but Steph is very popular. Why is he so popular? Why is he so popular if supposedly all the stuff he's saying is wrong? Why do I think he's so popular? Well, I mean, the fact is, when people are very passionate about something, or very, like if they're very convicted, passionate and conviction, people will follow you. Because the people who watch YouTube videos, and they're, I mean, I'd say on one hand, people who watch Steph's videos are looking for substance, but on the other hand, it's very easy to follow someone who's certain of what they're saying. Because then you don't have to think, right? You know, they'll tell you all the answers. They're an idol. They have the answers. You don't have to think for yourself. And it's weird because I'm not so sure that Steph encourages people to think for themselves. I mean, on the one hand, he says yes, but on the other hand, he at no point does he accept any sort of scrutiny. Like, he always has this air that what he believes is derived from first principles and therefore 100% deductive and logically correct, right? You know, he doesn't question himself. That's my point. He doesn't question himself, and that's a problem. That is a problem. As a philosopher, you should question yourself all the fucking time. All the time you should question yourself, okay? But questioning yourself isn't good, because if you question yourself, you know, people get kind of scared. Like, they don't know what to think. If this person questions himself, they don't know whether to believe you or not. They don't know whether to question themselves or not. You know, people like certainty. They really like certainty, and Steph brings them certainty. So that could be one explanation for why he's popular. The other reason is that, again, like, I agree with some of his views, so I guess some of his views must be popular because they're, like, decent views. You know, because the YouTube community, the people that watch those videos, you know, on the one hand, they're looking for philosophical guidance. They're looking for, you know, cultural commentary. They're looking for the type of fancy language that Steph uses, the imagery he uses. You know, he's definitely a writer. You can tell from the way he speaks, from the type of words he uses. He constantly uses metaphors and similes and all this very colorful imagery, and it's actually a pleasure to listen to. You know, I'm not even saying that Steph is stupid either. I'm not saying that he's insane or any of that. I have, like, some amount of respect for the guy, obviously. I mean, I wouldn't make a 2-hour video or an hour or whatever, however long video for someone I didn't respect at all. That doesn't make any sense, right? You know, the fact that this video spanned this length means that there was content, there was substance there that needed to be analyzed, right? The problem is, I think that for whatever reason that Steph has his views, he's had them for a very long time, and so it's very difficult to face scrutiny and to have those views be challenged and to actually give them up. Okay, the same thing happens to scientists all the time. If they've researched something their whole life and then some young freshman comes along and points out how what they're doing is wrong, they're gonna go crazy, of course. You know, this is their whole identity, is this stuff. You know, that's what I feel. I feel like this anarcho-capitalist stuff is Steph's identity, which is why he hasn't given it up for this long, because I'm sure it's faced tons of scrutiny. You know, these are like possible explanations for why he could believe in this stuff. As to why he's so convinced. I mean, that's just me speculating. It's also possible he's just been on the shit end of the government's stick this entire time, and so he says, "Oh, libertarianism, down with the system, right? Down with statism." Right, and it's, oh, actually no, the other facet to it is that actually no, I forget what I was going to say. Why is he so convinced? Right? Why is he so convinced? Well, whatever. The point is, I don't think that the type of attitude that Steph has is perfect. I think he encourages his viewers to be critical to an extent, but he's never critical of himself, and that's the big problem. If you asked me, am I critical of myself? Of course I am, 100%. I'm critical of everything I just said. I'm sure there was a few flaws in what I said. I don't think that in general what I said was wrong, but I'm still open to the possibility. I mean, hell, come at me and argue away, if you will. If you have ideas, share them. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that you should have come to the same conclusions that I should have, or that you should in general, and that if you don't, I'll give you a few months to reconsider, and then I'll just brush you aside because you're a state-supporting hippie. No, okay, that's ridiculous. That's not how we do business. The other problem with all this is that how could you possibly, like, Steph constantly compares his like moral contradictions and he was saying, he kept using this argument about how a principle has to apply equally to everyone, because if it didn't, it would be like a law of gravity that says that sometimes rocks fall up. That's a stupid analogy, I just want to say. First of all, Hume's fallacy is just Hume's guillotine. He just takes a machine gun and shoots the heck out of that thing, forgets about it. He throws it out into the abyss, okay? Forget that that even existed. No. The law of gravity. Okay, well, first of all, if I throw a rock up in the air, it's falling up during that duration. So yes, sometimes rocks do fall up. I'm sorry, Steph, sometimes they do. Other times, if a rock is magnetically charged, or if it's iron and you have a magnet above it, then it also is going to fall up. So yes, sometimes rocks do fall up. But no, that's not the point. The point is, reality is like this, therefore, morality should be like this as well. No, that doesn't happen. And, yeah, that doesn't happen, and frankly, I disagree. Right, what I was going to mention, though, is if the other problem, those are the obvious problems with comparing a principle of morality to a law of physics. The other problem of that is implicit, but you'd be comparing the field itself, and this is something he does, is comparing the field of morality and moral study to the field of science, or the field of ethics. And the problem there is that within science, within physics, within mathematics, there is consensus for things that are, for big principles like this. You know, there is basically consensus. You know, there is rigor in science, there is rigor in mathematics. If you started, you know, if somebody came to some conclusion, if somebody publishes a paper on math, then anybody else who reads the paper should do the same work and come to the same conclusions in mathematics and in physics and in science. You should, you know, an experiment should be testable. You do the experiment again, you get the same evidence, you get repeat evidence, and then the theory is proven, right? You don't get that in philosophy. Okay, so you can't draw a parallel between the two. This is not the obvious thing in what he was saying, but this is obvious. This wasn't the obvious thing in what he was saying, but this is true. Okay, you can't be drawing parallels between philosophy and science, because in science people draw consensus, and in science and in math there is rigor. As in, when somebody publishes a paper or proves a theorem or a theory or has an idea, it's provable, it's testable. Somebody else who hasn't had the experience of that person can come in, do the same experiment, and receive the same results, get the same results. And in math, they can start with the same assumptions and derive the same formulae. In philosophy, that never fucking happens. You know, different people will walk into the same room with different assumptions and come up with wildly different conclusions. Okay? It doesn't happen in philosophy, doesn't happen in morality. You can't draw that parallel. I mean, you can't draw that parallel for other more obvious reasons, but I'm just saying, here's another one. You can't be drawing parallels between those two because they're so different. Okay? Like, it's weird. I mean, how come in the field of mathematics everyone agrees on, like, you know, the ZF... Okay, not everyone agrees on the ZFC axioms, but, like, everyone agrees on the fundamental theorem of calculus, say, for the most part, right? Or everyone agrees on, I don't know, something else. But, like, not everyone in philosophy agrees on libertarianism. If libertarianism is so obvious, if it's so easily proven from first principles, then wouldn't everybody agree on it? But not everybody does. Libertarianism is one small camp in a sea of philosophical ideas that many people have. And then this confirms my point earlier, is that a lot of philosophy is bullshit. A lot of philosophy is just people's biases coming into play and you know, talking for them. I mean, it's still interesting. You know, philosophy, I'm not discounting the discipline altogether. I'm not saying it's a pointless field of study. It definitely has merit. I'm just saying you need to be aware of what it is and what it's not, and it is not science, and it is not mathematics, and it is not parallel to those two in any way, even though it tries to use logic. Anyway, that's the end of this. Oh, in full disclosure, I just want to say that for my morality, I am in fact a consequentialist. Unlike, I am a consequentialist, and I am a university student, and I study math and I study physics. So that could give you an idea of where I come from. And the reason I'm pointing that out is I think where one's ideas come from are an important part of what they are. Like, one's ideas do not exist in a vacuum. Who you are and what you think are intertwined. You know, they just so happen to be intertwined. And so, unlike Steph is master's in philosophical history, and he studied whatever, and not the point. I'm pointing out where I'm coming from. But yes, my arguments stand, and thank you for watching. GG.